Hi, my name's Jenny Leo, and I write historical fiction as Jennifer Lamont Leo. My Roaring Twenties series features two books. One's called You're the Cream in My Coffee, and the sequel's called Ain't Misbehavin'. After I finished writing that series, both set in 1920s Chicago, I found myself wanting to write a few more stories using those characters from those novels because they'd been so much fun to work with. I wrote a short story called Playing for Keeps that I'm going to share with you today, and the star of Playing for Keeps is Helen Corrigan. And Helen Corrigan in the two novels is a younger sister. She doesn't have a big role in those stories, but she is one of my favorite characters. She's charming and fun, and so I wanted to write another story just for Helen so she could be the star. So I wrote Playing for Keeps. This is also the first short story I set outside of Illinois or the Chicago area where the other novels are set. So this one takes young Helen on a visit to see an old friend in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And the year is 1928-ish. Playing for Keeps. Next stop, Rathdrum, Idaho. At the conductor's bellow, I consulted the dog-eared Northern Pacific timetable clutched in my damp palm, then stared out the train's grimy window. After 3 days on the North Coast Limited, it hardly seemed possible I'd arrived at last. A shiver of delight coursed down my spine. I peered into the little mirror glued inside the lid of my travel case. Hair combed? Check. Face washed? Check. My complexion looked pale, and faint shadows ringed my eyes, but there was nothing to be done about that. At 15, I was too young to wear face powder, or so decreed my stepmother Frances. An hour earlier, I'd latched myself into the restroom and changed into a fresh dress, blue cotton with embroidered cuffs and a white rolled collar. I yearned to show my old friend Maisie Summerfield that I was no longer a dungaree-wearing tomboy, at least not all the time. But a change of clothes did only so much good. Frankly, I needed a long, hot bath. Did the Summerfields even have a bathtub? Out in the untamed Idaho wilderness, a luxurious modern amenity like indoor plumbing might not be a given. I knew this thanks to my fondness for dime novels in which plucky spinsters headed west to escape overbearing relatives and found primitive living conditions along with romance if they were lucky, which they usually were. In her letters, Maisie had gushed about thick forests, towering mountains, and sparkling lakes. While she never stated outright that her family lived in a rustic log cabin tucked away in the back country, I could read between the lines. I imagined her churning butter and chopping wood, an impression strengthened as the train chugged through the northern Rockies. I stiffened my spine. If a hot bath was not to be had, I vowed to be gracious and uncomplaining. Hardships were to be expected as part of this great Idaho adventure. It would be fun, like last summer's trip to Camp Minnewawa, minus the poison ivy. I snapped the case shut. I'd looked forward to this trip for weeks, ever since Frances had received a letter from Mrs. Summerfield inviting me to spend part of summer vacation with her daughter, Maisie. Maisie had been my best chum at Caryville Grammar School until 3 years ago when her father's fancy new job with a big lumber mill uprooted her family to Idaho. When our teacher pointed to Idaho on the schoolroom map, my heart sank at the vast distance between here and Illinois. At last the engine steamed into the Rathdrum depot. I swiped at the smudged window with my hanky and thought of my last conversation with Maisie at the Caryville station. "You'll write to me?" Her eyes had looked suspiciously misty. "Of course, silly. Every week." I'd meant it, too. At first our letters had flown thick and fast, but then school and dramatics club and baseball practice had eaten up my time. Maisie was busy, too. Gradually our letters dwindled from weekly to once in a while. But all that was about to change. Now we'd pick up our friendship exactly where we'd left off. I reached into my pocket and fingered the gift I'd brought, a hefty cobalt blue cat's eye marble, a real beauty of a shooter. I'd coveted it for a long time and finally won it fair and square from Sammy Wardlow while playing for keeps. Now I was giving it to Maisie, because if ever a girl was as ace as shooting marbles, it was her. Anxiously I scanned the platform. Only a few people stood waiting. A man wearing a brown fedora pulled down over his eyes, another man in overalls, and two well-dressed ladies standing together. No sign of Maisie. I peered again at the man in the fedora. Perhaps Maisie's father had been sent to fetch me, but this man didn't look like Mr. Summerfield, as best as I could recall. I swallowed hard. What if everyone forgot I was coming? My gaze slid back to the two ladies, and my heart lurched. That wasn't two ladies. It was Maisie and her mother. Maisie was practically grown up. I stood, grabbed my case, and followed the other passengers off the train. "Hello!" I shouted, waving my arm. Maisie whirled around. "Helen, there you are." I dropped my case and flew at my friend, enveloping her in an ecstatic hug that knocked her hat askew. As we embraced, I noticed two things: how very tall Maisie had gotten, and how she was surrounded by the scent of roses. As for myself, I was certain I must stink to high heaven of soot and axle grease and worse. "Let me look at you." Maisie held me at arm's length, eyes sparkling. "It's so lovely to see you." "And how?" I returned the grin, but suddenly felt awkward. "So lovely to see you?" Since when did Maisie say things like "so lovely to see you"? That was grown-up talk. Who was this stranger? We stood gawking at each other like a couple of goofs. Not only was my friend tall and rose-scented, but she wore lip rouge the color of ripe strawberries, and her formerly waist-length hair had been chopped short around her ears, topped by a fashionable cloche. My own lips were bare, and my locks hung in two childish braids down my back, bobbed hair and lip rouge being two more things that Frances didn't approve of. Mrs. Summerfield kissed my cheek. "You must be exhausted after your trip, Helen dear," she said in her gracious way. Yes, that was it. I was tired. Everything would seem less strange after a good rest, and a bath, because it was clear from Maisie's appearance that the Summerfields did indeed own a bathtub. After we'd collected my luggage, Mrs. Summerfield led the way toward a shiny silver roadster parked nearby. I blinked. "Jeepers! This is yours?" Maisie laughed and said, "Of course. What did you expect? A lumber truck?" I echoed her laugh and adjusted my assumptions. I watched in admiration as Mrs. Summerfield slid behind the wheel. Not many women back in Caryville drove their own automobiles. We drove across a flat prairie ringed with mountains, then into the bustling town of Coeur d'Alene. My shyness faded as Maisie prattled on, asking questions about my trip and about people we both knew back home. I found it easier to talk to her if I kept my gaze on the scenery instead of on the poised and polished stranger sitting beside me. Mrs. Summerfield pointed out the newly built federal building and courthouse as imposing and governmental looking as anything back east. Sherman Avenue was lined on either side with intriguing-looking shops and cafes, and even a movie theater. To my surprise, Coeur d'Alene didn't look that much different from Caryville, except for the mountains. "Here we are," Mrs. Summerfield said at last, pulling into the driveway of a splendid white American foursquare with a wide, inviting porch and an emerald lawn that swept clear down to the sparkling waters of Lake Coeur d'Alene. The last shred of my log cabin vision whirled away on the lake breeze. Whatever Mr. Summerfield's job was over at that logging mill, he clearly didn't do it in sap-stained overalls. Mrs. Summerfield gave me a quick tour of the spacious downstairs rooms, filled with sunlight and smelling of oil and beeswax. Then she suggested I take a rest before dinner. Maisie helped me unpack in the sunny bedroom overlooking the lake. "Spiffy," she commented, shaking out my yellow dress with appliqued daisies and hanging it in the closet. "You can wear that to the party tonight." I yawned. "What party?" She picked up another garment. "Mother thought it would be a good idea to have some friends in to meet you, so you'd get to know people and start feeling comfortable right away." "Oh, but I thought..." "Thought what?" "Well, I thought I didn't know exactly what I thought, but I knew it involved only Maisie and me, not a bunch of other people." She giggled. "You're too tired to string two thoughts together. I'll let you get a bath and some rest. I'll wake you in time for dinner." "Okay." I felt the lump in my pocket. "Wait, I almost forgot. I brought you something." Proudly I produced the glorious marble and held it toward her. She took it and rolled it over in her hand. "Thank you. It's pretty." "Feel how heavy it is," I urged. "It's a top-notch shooter, Sammy Wardlow's pride and joy, until I made him fork it over. Boy, was he ever steamed when I yelled, 'Keepsies!'" I waited for her to congratulate me. She looked at me as if I were speaking Swahili. I sucked in a breath. "Anyway, I knew you'd like it." "I do." She turned it so it sparkled. "It's a beaut. I'll keep it right here on the dresser where it will catch the light." "Catch the light? It's for playing with," I said. Did I really have to explain? She shot me a sidelong glance. "At our high school, only boys play with marbles." My face grew hot. "Oh, piffle. What do the girls do?" "This and that." She gave a little shrug. "Play cribbage mostly, and talk about boys." I stared at her, unsure of what to say. Disappointment washed over me. This was going to be one long summer if all we could do was play cribbage and talk about boys. She set the marble next to a framed photo. "Who's that?" I pointed. Maisie blushed. "That's Herbert." Sensing we were entering strange and unfamiliar territory, I proceeded with caution. "Who's he?" Her color deepened. "A boy at school. I think he's the bee's knees, but he never even notices me. As far as he's concerned, I blend with the wallpaper." "Then he's a dope." A good-looking dope, I had to admit, although his ears did stick out a little. "You have your rest now," she said quickly. "You'll find clean towels next to the tub." Too flagged to argue, I soaked in the immaculate claw-footed tub, put on fresh underthings, and crawled into Maisie's bed. When I awoke, dazed and disoriented, the setting sun slanted through the window. Get out of bed, sleepyhead, Maisie chirped as she set a tray on the nightstand. You were sleeping so soundly that Mother didn't want to disturb you for dinner. She sent up a sandwich and a glass of milk instead, but now you'd better get changed. Our guests will be arriving any minute. I sat up and nibbled the ham sandwich while Maisie bustled around the room, chatting about this or that person who'd be at the party. Margaret's father works with Dad at the mill. She lives 3 doors down. Will Sir Herbert the Sublime be there? Yes, but you mustn't let on that I like him. I'd be mortified. Mum's the word. I noticed she'd changed into a sophisticated lilac-colored sheath, decorated with beaded swirls, and a matching headband worn low across her forehead. I sighed at the thought of my yellow daisy dress, in all its Midwestern earnestness. But after I was dressed, she pinned my hair in a way that made it look bobbed if you didn't peer too closely. She also lent me a bit of lip rouge. I smiled at the mirror. What Frances didn't know wouldn't hurt her. Downstairs the doorbell rang. Let's get a wiggle on, Maisie said, and off we went. The next couple hours passed in a blur. We sipped punch, and Maisie introduced me around. When the dancing started, I mostly stood by, changing records on the Victrola and watching Maisie turkey trot with one fellow after another, none of whom was Herbert. What was the matter with that goof? Couldn't he see Maisie was the cat's meow? Finally, bored and feeling like a canceled stamp, I escaped into the muggy parlor and wandered out to the porch. Moonlight spilled over the lawn and glittered on Lake Coeur d'Alene. I breathed in the refreshing pine-scented air. At one end of the porch, under an electric light, a group of boys knelt in a circle playing marbles. Suddenly, my shooting finger itched. I walked over to them. Hey, can I play? The boys glanced up. Herbert said, girls don't play marbles. Malarkey, says who? I'll let her in, said a boy named Stanley. She'll probably fizzle out anyway. I gathered my skirt and knelt on the plank floor. Stanley lined up a few Aggies from his stash, and I knuckled down. We're playing for fair, not for keeps, he said solemnly. I nodded. After several games in which I'd held my own, a shadow hovered. Glancing over, I recognized Maisie's dancing slippers. There you are, she said, hands on hips. I wondered where you went. Then she must have noticed Herbert, because her breath caught and fluttered a little. He didn't even glance up. I sighed. Clearly my help was needed. Maisie, I said with a meaningful look, why don't you go upstairs and fetch the present I gave you? I hoped she'd take the hint. If Herbert wouldn't dance with the girl, the least he could do is let her shoot. She hesitated, but left and came back carrying the blue cat's eye, along with a leather pouch filled with nibs that must have been tucked away somewhere with other childhood relics. Make room. She joined us on the floor. Herbert's eyes widened when he saw the gleaming cat's eye. They grew even wider as she handily won game after game. I grinned. The old Maisie was back. Later, when I spotted her and Herbert foxtrotting together, my heart sang that a talent for shooting marbles could succeed where lip rouge failed. I wandered across the dark lawn and found a bench facing toward Lake Coeur d'Alene. Moonlight rippled on the water. The boy called Stanley appeared out of nowhere. May I join you? It's a free country. I shifted over. He folded his lanky body onto the bench, careful not to spill a dish containing a heaping concoction of ice cream, chocolate syrup, and nuts. Want some? No, thanks. We sat in silence for a moment. Then he said, Gosh, I never met a girl who was good at marbles before. Maisie's a whiz, I agreed. I meant you. Oh. He cleared his throat. A bunch of us are going swimming tomorrow. You and Maisie should come. It was more a statement than a question. "Oh," I said again. It was going to be a long summer if all I could think of to say was "oh." He lifted a spoonful of ice cream, held it toward me, and smiled. Maybe this summer wasn't going to be such a dud after all. And that was the story, Playing for Keeps. And I'll be back tomorrow with another story because I want us to think good thoughts during this time of quarantine. And I think some good, wholesome stories will help us both feel better. Alrighty. Take care. Bye-bye.